The 20th century is usually hailed as an era of unprecedented technological ascent, a time when humanity strode from steam engines to the splitting of the atom. However, there is a shadow side to this progress, one not found in history textbooks. If one carefully examines the architectural and engineering archives of that time, it becomes obvious that the century of world wars was also a century of a massive technological purge. Across the globe, there was a systematic destruction of sources of so-called free energy, devices that could have rendered our modern dependence on hydrocarbons meaningless. This process affected every continent, including Europe, which is traditionally seen as a bastion of cultural preservation. The difference lay only in the methods. While in the Soviet Union, the destruction of ancient temples and misunderstood cult structures was crude, demonstrative, and involved explosives, processes often filmed by Secret Service agents. In Europe, the dismantling of the past was far more humane. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible war. Unique technical structures weren't blown up in front of crowds. They were simply declared dilapidated, incompatible with new urban plans, or subjected to renovations that completely erased their original function. European precision allowed the traces of technological regression to be hidden behind a mask of modernization, and for decades, no one paid this any proper attention. To understand the scale of this falsification, one need not infiltrate classified bunkers. It is enough to visit a very public place in France, the town of Turcoing, a suburb of Lille. Here stands the Le Fresnois Studio National des Arts Contemporains. To the average tourist or local resident, it is simply a popular cultural space with a cinema, a restaurant, and exhibition areas. The building looks comparatively young, barely 2 decades old, and stands out little among hundreds of similar objects across Europe. It seems there is no mystery here. However, one need only dig up archival documents and photographs from the first half of the 20th century for this blissful picture of modernity to start bursting at the seams. On the very same spot where the concrete and glass of modern art now stand, in 1930, there sat an object also referred to as an entertainment complex. But its appearance and structural features provoke a state of deep cognitive dissonance in any technically literate observer. The grounds of the old complex were carefully planned and landscaped, but rising among the alleys and recreation zones were strange engineering structures that fit neither the concept of a dance floor nor a park. We are talking about mysterious pillars topped with metal rings and a massive central tower. Official sources of that time call this tower a dovecote, but anyone familiar with the basics of electrical engineering and the designs of etheric electricity generators will see something else entirely. This is a domed installation of capital construction, having nothing in common with temporary park pavilions. The entire weight of the structure is distributed onto 4 powerful central pillars, and beneath the roof itself lay equipment whose true purpose is studiously met with silence. The rings, located on the edges of the tower and on the separate standing pillars, are not decorative elements. They do not hang chaotically. Their planes are clearly oriented in space, directed towards each other, creating a single invisible circuit. If you look closely at the details of this dovecote, you can notice that the rings on the tower's edge are turned not perpendicular to the tangent of the dome, but strictly towards similar receiving devices on the grounds. Moreover, the top of the dome is crowned with specific vases, often described in alternative technical literature as vessels for storing an active substance. The dance floor on the ground level was likely just a pleasant bonus, a secondary use of the space inside a powerful energy installation capable of generating a field of immense force. Now, not a trace remains of this magnificence. No tower, no fence, no strange pillars. European fastidiousness regarding monument preservation failed here, or more likely, this monument was too inconvenient for the new world picture. But France is just a small piece of a global mosaic. To assemble the whole picture, we will have to dig deeper and deconstruct the very physics of the process that allowed huge halls to be lit and heated without a single wire. The official designation of the central tower in the Turcoing complex as a dovecote falls apart under even superficial engineering scrutiny. A structure designed for breeding birds does not require a foundation and load-bearing structures capable of supporting heavy industrial equipment. However, the tower captured in the archives of the 30s was a capital structure, the entire mass of which rested on 4 massive central pillars. This architectural feature is characteristic of objects undergoing serious vibrational or static loads, certainly not a light garden building. The upper part of the construction, devoid of the usual windows for living or utility rooms, concealed within its volume something that required protection from the external environment but did not need the constant presence of personnel. While the first tier of the tower was used as a dance floor, above the heads of the revelers, right under the roof, an installation of a completely different order was functioning. The geometry of the tower's external elements finally destroys the legend of a decorative purpose. The metal rings encircling the cornice were mounted not chaotically and not for the sake of symmetry. Their planes were angled at strictly defined degrees, creating vectors directed exactly at similar ringed structures crowning separate pillars in the park. This was not architecture, it was a circuit diagram. Such precise orientation of elements towards each other is inherent only to systems of wireless signal or energy transmission, where the transmitter and receiver must be in direct line of sight and resonance. The summit of the dome was crowned with specific vase-like forms, often found in images of that era and identified by researchers as containers for an active substance needed for ionization or charge accumulation. The fate of the building itself adds to the mystery. In the interval between the 30s and the late 20th century, when the Modern Art Center was erected, the massive metal complex simply vanished. The information vacuum surrounding the demolition of such a substantial structure is striking. It is known only that for some time open sports grounds were located on this spot, which implies the complete dismantling of all structures down to the foundation. The European practice of carefully preserving historic buildings failed inexplicably here, as if the very existence of this object had become undesirable. But the most obvious proof of the past's technological superiority lies in the question of heating. The entertainment center building was made of metal. In the climate of northern France, such a structure instantly turns into a refrigerator in winter. To maintain a comfortable temperature in a huge hall, a powerful boiler room was required. However, not a single diagram, not a single description contains even a hint of smokestacks, coal storage, or connected gas mains. The absence of traditional heating systems in the presence of a comfortable internal environment can mean only one thing. Heat, like light, was generated directly on site, without burning fuel. The source of this energy was that very dovecote, which served as the heart of the local energy grid. To understand exactly how this system worked, it is necessary to analyze its components, which were masquerading as decorative elements. To understand how the complex in Turcoing functioned, one must discard habitual notions of decorative architecture and look at the building's elements from the perspective of high-energy physics. What an uninitiated observer takes for architectural excesses are actually functional nodes of a complex technical system. The central element of this scheme was the tower's dome. Its shape is not accidental. Spherical and domed surfaces are ideal for accumulating static potential from the atmosphere. However, the dome itself is merely the casing. The main secret lay in the details crowning the top. We are talking about those mysterious vases that can be seen in old images along the perimeter and at the peak of the roof. In alternative technical historiography, the contents of these vessels are often referred to by the term teen. This substance, the composition of which is lost or classified today, played the role of a catalyst or active medium necessary for ionizing the space around the generator. Essentially, these vases functioned as capacitors or spark gaps, creating a primary charge that was then amplified by the tower's structure. The interaction of atmospheric electricity with the substance inside the vases triggered the generation process, turning a passive structure into a powerful energy source. The gathered energy needed to be distributed, and here is where those rings on the pillars came into play. Their strange tilt, inexplicable from an aesthetic point of view, makes strict sense in the context of wave transmission. These were not decorations, but directional antenna resonators. The rings on the tower acted as transmitters, forming a carrier frequency, while the rings on the remote pillars served as receivers. The system worked on the principle of resonant induction, allowing electricity to be transmitted wirelessly over significant distances within the complex. It is this technology that explains the mystery of heating the metal dance hall building. The absence of pipes and boiler rooms becomes logical if we assume that the metal frame of the building itself was the heating element. Under the influence of an electromagnetic field of a specific frequency created by the generator, induction currents arose in the metal, heating the structure and ensuring a comfortable temperature even in winter. Lighting was also part of this wireless network. Garlands and lamps hung across the territory were powered directly by the field created by the pillars with rings, requiring no physical connection via cables. Such autonomy and efficiency of the system were likely the reasons for its destruction. The object in Turcoing didn't just fall into disrepair, it was completely dismantled, replaced by typical modern construction, as if trying to erase any mention of the existence of such technologies. However, the scrubbing of history is never perfect. If in Europe, the center of geopolitical intrigues, tracks were covered particularly thoroughly, in other corners of the planet, control was not as total. The digital archives of countries that were on the periphery of political life at that time have preserved documents for us that allow us to view the scale of etheric technology application from a completely new angle. Censorship failed where it was least expected, opening access to fantastic evidence of the past that official science cannot explain. The digital age has presented researchers with an unexpected gift: access to the national libraries of states that were considered the deep periphery in the early 20th century. It was there, far from the European centers of decision-making, that the work of censors proved insufficiently thorough. If in the archives of New Zealand, tampering with historical documents was crude and obvious, on many photos, building roofs are literally sliced off during retouching to hide the equipment installed on them. Brazilian archivists preserved materials in practically pristine condition, and these materials reveal to us a picture of a global transport system that seems impossible from the viewpoint of modern physics. Old photographs from South America capture trams cruising along busy streets. At first glance, this is ordinary public transport of that era, but upon careful examination, a technical oddity becomes obvious. These machines completely lack current collectors. There are no pantographs familiar to us, no bows, and, most importantly, no contact wire network stretched above the street. Heavy carriages, often loaded to capacity, move on their own. Skeptics and defenders of the official version of history often advance the argument of power supply through the rails, citing modern subways or experimental contact rail systems as examples. However, this version crumbles when faced with the reality of operating street transport at the turn of the century. Tram tracks were on the same level as cobblestones or dirt roads. People walked on them. Carriages drove over them. Animals ran across them. Supplying high voltage to rails in such conditions would have led to mass accidents. Moreover, the very first rain or accumulation of street mud would have created a short circuit, paralyzing the entire system. Energy losses when transmitting current through grounded and wet rails would have been so colossal that no power plant of that time could have compensated for them. Nevertheless, these trams operated successfully for years, as confirmed by numerous chronicles. The secret of these machines' autonomy, evidently, was hidden inside. Images of luxury class tram interiors have survived, the finishing of which staggers the imagination. But the interest lies not in the velvet seats, but in the ceiling. Instead of ordinary light fixtures, strange dome structures are installed there. These hemispheres are too large and complex for simple incandescent bulbs. Their shape suspiciously resembles scaled-down copies of the domes we saw on the generator towers. It is quite likely that these were compact receiving devices, harvesting energy from the external field to power the electric motors. The existence of such transport on different continents suggests that the technology was standardized and distributed everywhere. The world was united by a single energy grid, the operating principles of which we are only beginning to grasp. But if trams consumed energy from the ether, where were the sources saturating the atmosphere with this electricity on an industrial scale? The answer to this question lies in the very heart of Europe, at an event that was supposed to demonstrate the triumph of science, but in reality showed something entirely different. To see the true source of power, we need to transport ourselves to 1881, to the famous Paris Electrical Exhibition. The International Exposition of Electricity of 1881 in Paris is officially considered a triumph of engineering thought, the moment when electric lighting began its victorious march across the planet. However, upon detailed study of archival materials, this event generates more questions than answers. The exhibition pavilions in the photographs are flooded with blinding light. Given the low efficiency of incandescent lamps of that time, providing such illumination required power calculated in megawatts. According to the laws of conservation of energy, somewhere nearby there should have been giant steam engines, mountains of coal, and a complex system of cables. But nothing of the sort is in the pictures. Instead of the generators familiar to us, the exhibition halls are filled with objects that modern catalogs modestly term industrial items, or samples of decor. Upon closer inspection, these objects turn out to be complex technical devices. The halls are cluttered with models of churches, lattice structures, spires, and strange metal trees. These are not merely architectural fantasies, but functional elements of an energy harvesting system. Particular attention is drawn to tabletop devices shaped like menorahs or branching antennas. It is obvious that their complex geometry served not for beauty, but to create a resonant circuit. If such a device were placed on a chandelier or table, it began to work as a local receiver of the etheric field, ensuring the glow of lamps without a visible power source. Even more illustrative are the chandeliers themselves. Many images show that the lamps are equipped with massive counterweights, allowing the suspension height to be adjusted. The traditional explanation boils down to ease of maintenance, but the construction of these counterweights is too complex and voluminous for a simple weight containing sand. It is highly probable that the secret of autonomy lay hidden within these containers, that same tin or a similar substance working in conjunction with atmospheric electricity. The mechanism for raising and lowering the chandelier in this case served not only for changing bulbs, but for tuning the device to the necessary field potential, which changes depending on altitude. The operating principle of these devices was based on fractal geometry. The numerous spires, fringes, lattices, and serrated crests adorning the pavilions served as charge concentrators. In electrostatics, it is known that charge drains from and accumulates on points and surface irregularities. What we are accustomed to considering ornate Victorian decor was actually an engineering solution to maximize the energy collection area. This technology was so mundane that it was applied everywhere without causing surprise among contemporaries. Even purely utilitarian structures, such as public toilets, were designed in the form of miniature chapels or temples. Archival footage reveals street lavatories crowned with domes, featuring spires and characteristic metal fringe along the roof perimeter. This proves that domed architecture was not exclusively tied to religion. It was a technical standard. If even a sanitation point required the installation of a dome for autonomous ventilation and lighting, then what was the true purpose of the giant cathedrals? To understand this, we will have to lift our heads and look at the roofs of religious structures, discarding imposed stereotypes about religious symbolism. The most amazing discovery awaits us where familiar crosses and apples appear in their true, technical guise. A careful analysis of the structural features of past religious buildings forces a complete re-evaluation of their true purpose. Traditional history asserts that gilded domes, spires, and spheres, often called apples, carried exclusively sacred meaning. However, an engineering gaze detects in these forms elements of a complex technical system, where religion was merely a later layer superimposed on forgotten technology. Modern architects are particularly baffled by glass domes topped with massive metal spheres. From the perspective of classical statics, placing a heavy apple on a fragile translucent structure is a risky and illogical decision. But if we view this device as a high-voltage capacitor, everything falls into place. The glass acts as an ideal dielectric, separating the external environment from the internal volume, while the metal sphere on top serves as a terminal for collecting atmospheric electricity. The metal rafters holding the glass play the role of a conductive frame in this scheme, down which the charge descended to consumers. No less functional is the elaborate metal fringe that abundantly adorned the roof ridges and cornices of old buildings. What is perceived today as Baroque or pseudo-Russian aesthetic is, in the language of electrostatics, called a system of distributed spark gaps. A multitude of small metal prongs and needles along the roof perimeter created an effect known in physics as point discharge. This allowed for the ionization of the air around the building, increasing the conductivity of the medium and the efficiency of energy collection by the domed installation. The most striking example of the utilitarian use of such temples is found in archival records of water-lifting structures in district towns of the Russian Empire. Descriptions and blueprints have survived of objects indistinguishable from Orthodox chapels that stood over water sources. Inside these chapels, there were no altars, but complex mechanical drives were located there. The absence of external power sources, such as steam boilers or power lines, is baffling unless one acknowledges the obvious. The chapel dome itself was the engine. The cross, or spire, worked as an antenna, creating a potential difference that drove deep well pumps or piston groups. Later, when the technology was lost, these pumping stations were either destroyed or repurposed for purely religious needs, with the incomprehensible mechanics removed from inside. Thus, the dense network of churches and cathedrals covering old cities actually represented a unified energy grid. These stations generated a field in which wireless trams operated, filamentless lamps glowed, and huge public buildings were heated. Humanity possessed technologies that allowed for obtaining colossal amounts of energy, literally from the air, without burning fossil fuels or complex logistics. It was a world where light and heat were as much a public good as air or water. A logical and alarming question arises. Why today, at the peak of so-called progress, are we forced to pay for every kilowatt? And why do the global economy and politics revolve around the fight for oil and gas? The answer to this question lies not in the laws of physics, but in the laws of economics and power. Piecing together the scattered fragments of the mosaic, from the strange tower in French Turcoing to the wireless trams of South America and the shining pavilions of Paris, we arrive at an inevitable and staggering conclusion. What is habitually presented to us as the age of steam and coal was actually the heyday of a unified, highly developed civilization possessing technologies superior to modern ones. It was a world united, not only by a common architectural aesthetic, but by a single energy standard. Borders between states were nominal, and knowledge about obtaining energy from the environment was publicly available and universally implemented. Etheric energy was the circulatory system of that world, providing limitless possibilities for development, illumination, and creation without damage to the ecology. However, it was precisely this limitlessness and lack of cost that became the death sentence for the old order. In a world where anyone can obtain energy simply by placing the correct resonator on the roof of their house, it is impossible to build a system of total financial control. Wireless electricity cannot be run through a meter. It cannot be rationed, sold by tariff, or disconnected for non-payment. It belongs to everyone, like the air. This fundamental property of etheric technologies ran counter to the interests of the emerging financial industrial elites, who saw the source of power not in creation, but in the monopoly on resources. The turn of the 19th and 20th centuries became a bifurcation point, the moment of the Great Reset. A narrow circle of people possessing influence and capital made the decision to switch humanity to different rails of development. A grandiose special operation was implemented to replace technologies. Efficient, clean, and free etheric energy was declared pseudoscience, and the installations for its generation were systematically destroyed or rebuilt, stripped of function. They were replaced by primitive but commercially profitable sources: oil, coal, and gas. The hydrocarbon needle allowed for the creation of the perfect model of dependency. To get light and heat, a person must constantly pay. The entire global economy was rebuilt to service this scheme, where resources are extracted, transported, and burned, bringing colossal profits to the owners of the pipe and the wires. The world wars of the 20th century, aside from geopolitical tasks, brilliantly handled the role of a global bulldozer. In the fires of conflict, not only millions of lives burned, but also material evidence of the past era. Destroyed cities were rebuilt according to new rules, without generator spires, but with a dense network of cables and pipelines. Simultaneously, physics was rewritten. The concept of ether vanished from textbooks, and the works of Tesla and his predecessors were either classified or marginalized. Whole generations of engineers grew up with the conviction that wireless energy transmission is impossible, and burning fuel is the only path to civilization. The history we study in schools and universities is a carefully edited curtain designed to hide the fact of a gigantic technological regression. We have been indoctrinated to believe we are at the peak of progress, while in reality, we are living on the ruins of a more perfect world using the pitiful remnants of former greatness remodeled for profit extraction. But truth has a property of leaking through any barrier. Digital archives, old photographs, and miraculously surviving blueprints have become those breaches in the wall of lies through which the light of truth shines. The puzzle has finally come together. We see the picture in its entirety, and it is frightening in its scale and cynicism. The facts lie on the surface, and now it depends only on you. Continue to believe in the official fairy tale of linear progress, or open your eyes and admit that humanity has had its real future stolen.